late at least. I don't know about you guys on the dollar short thing, but we don't we don't do this for the money, do we?
We're always a dollar short.
Yeah. uh, so anyway, today on Renewalcast, we're talking about the law of God. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, and we're just going to kind of continue in that discussion. We are going through the Second London Baptist Confession, and we got through the first 3 paragraphs there, and now we're going to start on paragraph 4 and wrap up our conversation on the law of God today, hopefully. So just want to start off here by, I was reading about that, and I noticed that I do this a lot too. Sorry, got some beeping going on. I do this too when I talk about morals and ethics. I kind of use the terms interchangeably, but really, the two words aren't interchangeable. They're distinct. Morals are talking about the way things are, and ethics then talk about the way things ought to be. So as R.C. Sproul talks about it, he says, morals is isness, and ethics are oughtness. So when we're talking about the law, we're talking about more on ethics, why things ought to be, the philosophical reason why we do the things we do. So I think that there's this kind of confusion there on what role the law plays in our life, and we're going to try to add some clarity, hopefully, to that today a little bit. So maybe let's just start in paragraph 4 and jump in. You want to read that, Jay?
To them also he gave sundry judicial laws, which expired together with the state of that people, not obliging any now by virtue of that institution, their general equity only being of moral use.
Okay, so this kind of is a good continuation, I guess, a little bit of maybe just kind of go back and talk a little bit about what we talked about last time and kind of get us up to speed, because now we're talking about the judicial law, and basically he's saying the confession here is saying that the judicial laws have expired, which expired together with the state of that people. So God gave them law that isn't enforced today. Is that kind of the idea there with the judicial laws?
Yeah, last week we discussed the threefold distinction of the law, the ceremonial law, which is the worship of Israel, which the sacrifices, the priesthood, all those things, the temple. Christ fulfilled all those things. Therefore, they are fulfilled, and we no longer sacrifice. We no longer have a temple. We no longer need a priesthood. Jesus is our high priest. So the ceremonial has been taken away. The next aspect is the judicial. We mentioned that last week, I believe. But the judicial is those laws that pertain to Israel as a theocratic kingdom on earth and as a nation on earth. And so they were a unique nation in which God was their king. And so they had unique laws for that kingdom that don't apply, say, to the United States one for one, or Canada or Mexico. So there are general principles we can derive from that are wise, okay, but that has been abrogated with the ceasing of that theocratic nation. Yes. And then the third aspect, the moral law, which is that which is simply a revelation of the character of God. The moral law is it reveals God's character And God's character is the standard for morality, good and evil. God's character is the standard. That's the
So
moral.
when we read about the judicial law in the Bible, how is it a benefit to us if it's expired? I mean, is it a benefit, or how do we use it? What do we do when we see it? How can we? One of the big questions is how do we take and apply some of these things we read to our lives in the Bible? And so, what do we do with the judicial law?
Well, I think that there's obviously a lot of wisdom in much of it that derives from moral principles, even. But we are not commanded to go and kill the Canaanites and the Hittites and those kind of commands don't apply to us. And so you just got to be very careful. I think there are general principles of that we can derive from it that are wise that we can apply today to any nation. Jay, what would you say?
Yeah, natural law. Certainly, some of the laws may be good for us to have, but we're not under those specific laws as Israel.
Right.
Yeah, but I think you made a really good point here that those laws were given specifically for them in their situation, right? To go and kill the Hittites or whatever. But still, all of these laws that were given to them back then were given by God, and they were still based on his character. And it doesn't come in conflict with God's moral character and his holiness and his righteousness. Those things are the same. There's not a difference in God back then and a difference in God today. The moral law is the same. Just as God, and that's based on God's character, which does not change. So, when we look at those laws back then, we see something of God's character in there as well.
So the judicial law to the Jews is abolished, but the moral equity of those is not.
Yes.
Okay. What about theonomy? Right? Isn't this is it? That would be a system that would be more interested in trying to apply some of these laws to our situation, right? Like a theonomist. They're concerned with applying the civil laws. So they think that things that were mentioned in the judicial law back then, like consequences for fortune telling, blasphemy, sexual behavior, some of those things that should be actually regulated in our laws today.
Yeah, I'm not a theonomist expert and very much an amateur, so I would just defer to Jay on this.
I was going to say the same thing. I have not. I think, yes, they want those laws applied today. I think there's variations in theonomy as well. But I think they have a problem with covenant of works and how they understand some of that. So someone would ask, should Christians want the evangelization of idolaters or their execution?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Both.
Well, I just yeah, I didn't want to get into a big discussion about. I didn't want to get into a big discussion about theonomy. I just wanted to kind of point out that there are some today that would say that there is a place in our laws for those things, and
I would say theonomy is actually maybe becoming a bigger deal in some circles. Seems to be coming out of the woodwork, if you will, if it's hasn't been as prominent in the past. But
we'll have to have a theonomist expert on to tell us about this. How's that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if anybody out there knows somebody. What if, and we kind of mentioned this already, though, this idea that judicial law included some, killing the Hittites or whatever you mentioned. I think that sometimes when we read the Old Testament and we see some of the things that God commanded the Israelites to do, we kind of get a little bit offended. Should we be? Is that what we're saying here? That these laws have expired? That it's okay to be offended by some of the things that God prescribed back then that He does not prescribe, today in our situation? What would you say to somebody that said that he's offended by God asking the Israelites to kill different people group, or impose such harsh penalties for different things?
Well, I would say.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to tack on there and just say if I'm right, I think I am, that I think the Ten Commandments just the penalties for breaking those all, save maybe one, coveting, were the death penalty.
Okay, so let's take the. I think you're talking more about like the original question, maybe like with go kill the Canaanites,
Right.
every last one of them, their kids, all that stuff. So how I would answer that, your first question, would be I would say, well, I kind of understand what you're talking about, and our sensibilities are a little bit ruffled sometimes at those things. But I would say I think we need to make sure that we understand that is the problem is within us, and it's not within God or His Word. I would say I think the problem is we lose our sense of who God is, and God, His actions, His commands are always righteous and good, and never should be questioned by the Creator. And that is rebellious when we do. And so I would just say whenever we sense that rising up within our own hearts, I think we need to check it. God's cup was full with the Canaanites, and He was done with them, and it was judgment time. And there's no question that God was righteous in His actions there, and He was using Israel as a tool of His judgment.
Yeah, I think you're right. That the only reason that those things that God doesn't. He had a right to judge everyone, and God has a right to show mercy on who God shows mercy. R.C. Sproul says this. He says, since the Old Testament came from God, who is holy and righteous, we should not be offended by any laws that we read there. If we are offended by them, it is because our thinking has been distorted by a secular perspective on law, righteousness, and ethics.
Amen. Yeah, he said it much more eloquently than I was trying, but yeah.
Yeah, he had more of a chance to think through it than just have the question popped up. But no, I thought I just as you were talking, actually, I thought of that quote because you were saying the same thing. So, were you going to say something, Jay? You got something else on paragraph 4? Can we go to 5?
Let's go. 5.
The moral law does forever bind all, as well justified persons as others, to the obedience thereof, and that not only in regard of the matter contained in it, but also in respect of the authority of God, the Creator, who gave it. Neither does Christ and the gospel any way dissolve, but much strengthen this obligation.
So, Jesus said in Matthew 5:17 and 18, don't think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one iota or dot will pass away from the law until it is accomplished. So here's the question, and I think this is a practical one when we're talking about this issue of law and how it relates to us. Does this mean that we are released from the obligations of the law? How do we see
No.
that? Okay.
We are not under the law as a covenant. We are not under the law. We are not under the curses of the law. We
Okay.
are not under the condemnation and accusations of the law, and we are not under the rigor, the demands of the law to be pleasing to God, to merit His favor in any way. So we're not on the law with God as a covenant. Our covenant is of grace, and I think what this is getting at in paragraph 5 is that the authority of God as the Creator and His demands that you obey Him never, ever, ever, ever go away. And so, and matter of fact, because you are a redeemed creature and because you have His Spirit, your obligation is only heightened and strengthened. And that is what this is saying. And so, and in the next paragraph, I think 6, we're going to see that so if someone wants to obey God just because He's God and it's right for us to obey God, that is actually a good thing, because that doesn't mean you're lost or you're under the law. If you realize your obligation to God as your Creator and you want to obey Him, that's actually a sign you're redeemed. That's what paragraph 6 is saying. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of that.
No, I think we can kind of talk about all these at once, actually. Maybe we just ought to read 6 and talk about it all, kind of, because it does.
Although true believers are not under the law as a covenant of works, to be thereby justified or condemned, yet it is of great use to them as well as to others, in that as a rule of life, informing them of the will of God and their duty, it directs and binds them to walk accordingly, discovering also the sinful pollutions of their natures, hearts, and lives, so as examining themselves thereby, they may come to further conviction of, humiliation for, and hatred against sin, together with a clearer sight of the need they have of Christ and the perfection of His obedience. It is likewise of use to the regenerate to restrain their corruptions, and that it forbids sin, and the threatenings of it serve to show what even their sins deserve, and what afflictions in this life they may expect for them, although freed from the curse and unallayed rigor thereof. The promises of it likewise show them God's appropriation of obedience, and what blessings they may expect upon the performance thereof, though not as due to them by the law as a covenant of works, so as man's doing good and refraining from evil, because the law encourages to the one and deters from the other, is no evidence of his being under the law and not under grace.
Okay, so there's a ton of stuff here in both these paragraphs, and it's almost one of those things where you just got to sit back and think about a part of it for a while. But so I get stuck on that word and when I asked the question a moment ago about, I said, are we released from the obligations of the law? You know, that word obligations there kind of, I don't know, for me, because then, you read what Jesus said. I didn't come to abolish the law of prophets. I came to fulfill them. And then, not one dot or iota will pass away until all is accomplished. So he's obviously not saying that law is irrelevant, but he's saying that he fulfilled it. So then where does that leave us in all of this? Let me quote R.C. Sproul again here. He says, when he's talking about the Christian's obligation to the law, he said, we're now going to skate along the edge of heresy and peer down into the abyss of antinomianism, where there is a fine distinction to be made. Maybe I'll just stop there in the quote, and let's we've talked about this before on the podcast, but antinomianism, what's that heresy?
Well, it's 2 words put together: two Greek words put together: anti, which means against; nomos, which means law, against law. It was first used by Luther, and when some of his disciples started reacting to Luther's teaching, his use of the law, like we're talking about, they said Lutherans were legalistic, and so Luther called them antinomians. That's when the phrase was coined. The other groups, Presbyterians, Baptists, everybody, Congregationalists, picked up that word and used it not so strictly just for those who denying law, but people who would supposedly go to the other ditch, the opposite of legalism. Whoever would get in that other ditch, they would call antinomian historically. Right. Yeah. If I could go back to, you keep throwing these double shots at us. So I want to go back to your first shot. If I could go back to Matthew 5, you said, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill them. And then you read 18. Truly I say to you, until heaven and earth have passed away, not an iota, not a dot will pass until all the law is accomplished. But we got to read 19 too. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And so clearly that the application for the people in the kingdom of heaven is the moral law is to be taught and practiced. Right?
Right. But it is also clear there that Jesus is the one that fulfilled them.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
So if Jesus fulfilled the law, then what is the obligation for us? That's my question. That's how I'm kind of getting to antinomianism here too. Is that, and I think R.C. Sproul is in. I just thought the way that he puts this is so interesting here. That we're gonna to have this conversation about our relationship to the law. We have to get pretty close to heresy here. We have to get to the edge without falling into the abyss. And we've talked about this before too, that you got to skate between two ditches, on either side. So,
we're walking a tightrope.
Right.
And so I think the confession there, I personally like the confession. Maybe you're objecting to the word obligation. Is that kind of what you're saying? And that's fine. This isn't the Bible. That we use this as
no. I'm not necessarily. I mean, I don't know what better way to put it. I don't have a problem with the word necessarily, but it does seem like that word puts us back under the law. That we're obligated to keep it where Christ already fulfilled it. You see what I'm saying there? If Christ fulfilled it, then what's
I see what you're saying, and I think that we've talked about this before. I've studied the antinomianism, pretty. One of the charges the antinomians were making, was that we cannot use any really other terminology other than gratitude, and it makes obedience to the law of God a courtesy, so to speak. Okay. Mm-hmm. And we're not obligated to it. We're not bound to it. And the antinomians wanted to say it's just out of gratitude as a sort of a thankful courtesy to God. And the Westminster Confession divines put this stuff in here, this terminology, to refute where they were at on this. And that's why you see in paragraph 6 even that, look, if a guy just understands that God is God and has a law to be obeyed and will bless those who obey, and he wants to obey for that motive, that is not a sign that he's under the law, but under grace. And so I understand that I understand your reservation there, and it does get pretty close to that line. But I'm just saying, historically, they wanted to walk that edge historically. Yeah. And Whitney Gamble's book on antinomianism is an excellent place historically to see. She records this stuff. some of these statements, even why they put them in there.
If we're talking about the use of obligation in paragraph 5. Is that
Yeah.
so? That paragraph 5 isn't necessarily getting that far yet. It's just saying Christ fulfilling the law doesn't get rid of the moral law. The moral law carries through in redemptive history.
Yeah, and I
Right.
would agree. And so that's why we kind of went ahead of ourselves into chapter 6. And Colt said, well, let's talk them all together. And so we kind of brought the idea of chapter 6 into it as well. And
Right.
they're
And so
related.
right. And I'm just kind of asking that question.
Yeah.
Well, what, if Christ fulfilled the law, then what is our obligation to it? So let me keep going in R.C. Sproul's thought here a little bit, and how he threaded this needle a little bit and got close to the edge of antinomianism without going in the ditch. I just want to see what you guys think of this, because I thought it was interesting. So he says in this, he's speaking of the Mosaic covenant, and he says this, quote, "There is a very real sense in which the Christian is no longer under that covenant. If we insist that we are under that covenant, we are falling into the Judaizing heresy, a kind of legalism that we have in fact denied, in where we have denied the perfect work of Christ." And then he goes on and says, "So far, what we have said could be construed as unvarnished antinomianism," because he says we're not under the covenant. If we say we are under the covenant, if we say there is an obligation, I'd use the word obligation there. If you say that we are obligated to that covenant, then we're undermining the perfect work of Christ. So then this is what he says. So far, what we've said could be construed as unvarnished antinomianism. What we mean is that we are not under the damnation, the bondage, the power of the law, nor are we under the covenantal obligation to the Old Testament law. However, as New Testament Christians in the New Covenant, we are called to please God and imitate Christ. The Old Testament law reveals to us what is pleasing to God. So we still have a spiritual and moral obligation as part of the New Covenant to meditate on God's law day and night. We no longer have a covenantal relationship through Moses, but we do have a covenant relationship through our mediator, Jesus Christ. So
Yeah, and I think we made that clear several times that we are not under the law, we're not under the curse of the law, we're not under the rigor of the law. You know what I'm saying? I think we've made that
Right.
point. And RC made it very eloquently. I'm thankful you read that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's not controversial with us because we've all said those things too, though, is what I'm right?
Right. No, right.
Right.
So I guess my thought in all of this is he is making a fine distinction, and we've done this too, and I'm just trying to help the person who is thinking about our obligation to the law, to say, well, we're not obligated to the law because we're not under the Mosaic covenant, but we do have an obligation to please Christ. I mean, that we should long to do that, and certainly that. Then so I think it's interesting how I would say that there's not an obligation to the Mosaic law, but there is an obligation to Christ, and I like the word there.
And I agree with you, Colt. I would also say the confession is making a point as God as creator. And Sam Waldron says this in his commentary on the 69. He says, if one ever speaks to such of duty and obligation, their response that such exhortations are legalistic. Because that does sound, when we talk about duty and obligation, it's the bottom of 285. When we talk about duty and obligation, a lot of people in our day and age, we are living in an antinomian day and age, I believe, we think that sounds legalistic. So anyway, reading on in Waldron, Christ strengthens the original authority of the law. He does not put the content or the matter of the law on a new foundation. He does not eliminate the obligation to obey our Creator. but adds the obligation of gratefully obeying our Redeemer. And yeah, and so I think the confession is just saying that just the fact that he is our creator and we are his creature, if we are right-minded folks, we are going to understand we have an obligation to obey him as a creator. Much less the fact that he's our redeemer and we've been redeemed by Christ. And we come at it from that perspective.
Right.
As a redeemed child of God.
And I underlined that. I underlined that as well in Waldron's book, and just that, but adds the obligation of gratefully obeying our Redeemer. And I think when we stress gratitude as a motivation to keep the law, I think that's I think that's kind of the line there in my mind, I guess, is yes, God's your creator. And this is what God wants, so you're obligated to keep him. But for Christians, for the believer, there's this added motivation that really supersedes, that you long to please the one that redeemed you, that purchased you from the slave market of sin, and I love that. But
and I love that too. And whenever I talk about it, I'm writing actually in our paper on the law this month. I write for September. And my basically the only motivation I'm throwing out is gratitude. I'm trying to emphasize that. And so when I'm talking to people, normally I'm going to talk that way, but I'm also realizing that we're reading a historical piece here that is written against antinomianism. And so I think we need to appreciate at the same time some of these arguments that were going on. It'll help us get have clearer lines, I think, between the road and the ditch.
Yeah. I just go ahead, Jay. Go ahead.
I'm going to read a couple passages that I think are helpful here. Romans 3:31. Do we then nullify the law through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish the law. I lost it now. Because by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. For through the law comes the knowledge of sin. Romans 3:20. Galatians 3:21. Is the law then contrary to the promises of God? May it never be. For if a law has been given which was able to impart life, then righteousness would indeed have been based on the law. And that's giving into paragraph 7. But the law and the gospel are not... We need to keep them distinct, but they don't work against each other.
Yeah, they sweetly comply in the Christian life. In the Christian life, they sweetly comply. For justification, they are contrasted, obviously. But in the Christian life, they sweetly comply.
Yeah. And sweetly complies right from the confession, right? If we would have read paragraph 7. Yeah.
Right.
I like that. In paragraph 7, the Spirit of Christ subduing and enabling the will of man to do that freely and cheerfully, which the will of God revealed in the law requires to be done. So there's this idea there that the believer then, because of the Spirit working in them, is choosing to do what they now want to do. They're freely choosing. It's not, and it's not obligation. It's not I have to do this in order to maintain this kind of relationship. It's I have this kind of relationship, and because I have this relationship, now I want to, and I freely, cheerfully long to do what the law says. And like you pointed out last podcast, I think John, or maybe it was Jay, that the psalmist says, I love your law. I meditate on it day and night. So, how can, how can the believer love the law? It's because they love the Lord, they love God, and because they love Him, they freely cheerfully choose to and want to be obedient to it, and they have the strength and the power to do that because of the power of God.
Yeah, the law is the same. Our relationship to it has changed, and so we, as you said, we long, we desire to do what God wants us to do because of that new relationship, having the Holy Spirit within us. So, yeah, it's enjoyable.
The law is a revelation of the character of God. And so we love the law.
Yeah.
We don't jump on it to try to be saved by it,
Right.
but we love it because we love God.
We obey from life.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good distinction there, from life, not to life. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
Well, anything else, guys? Or are we gonna have a world record shortest podcast here? I don't know how long we've done, but
I don't think we made that.
Long. Well, okay, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, we'll come back probably Wednesday next week. All right. Have a good day.